I was already an adult when he invited me, old enough to know that some moments arrive quietly and still manage to divide your life into before and after. At the time, it didn't feel dangerous. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt ordinary in the way most mistakes begin, wrapped in familiarity, softened by trust. Asterisk, he had been my father's friend for as long as I could remember. The kind of man whose name was spoken casually at our dinner table, whose shoes rested by our door during visits, whose laughter blended easily with my father's. Growing up, I never questioned his presence. He was simply there, like an old photograph on the wall, noticed, respected, and rarely examined too closely. Asterisk, after my mother passed, my father leaned on old friendships more than ever. And this man, steady and dependable, was always near. He helped with errands, checked in when my father was too proud to ask for help, and spoke to me like someone who had watched me grow, but knew when to keep his distance. Or at least I believed he did. Asterisk, the invitation came on a weekday evening, delivered casually, almost carelessly. He said my father had mentioned I'd been overwhelmed lately. He offered dinner, conversation, a quiet place to breathe. There was nothing improper in his tone, nothing that raised alarms. If anything, it sounded thoughtful, concerned, familiar. Asterisk, I hesitated longer than I expected. Not because of fear, but because of a strange weight in my chest I couldn't explain. Still, I told myself I was imagining things. Trust, after all, had always lived comfortably between our families. Saying no felt unnecessary, even rude. So I said yes. Asterisk all day. I tried to treat the evening like a normal plan. I worked, answered messages, moved through my routine. Yet something lingered beneath the surface, a mild tension that refused to settle. It wasn't dread. It was awareness, the kind that makes you notice the quiet too much. Asterisk, when I arrived, his house was exactly how I remembered it, clean, orderly, slightly lonely. The air smelled like dinner and old books. He greeted me politely, with the same respectful distance he'd always kept. If anyone had been watching, they would have seen nothing unusual. And yet, I felt the shift immediately, like stepping into a room where the furniture had been moved, just enough to throw off your balance. Asterisk, we talked about simple things at first. My work, my father, the passing of time. His voice was calm, measured, but his attention felt sharper than before. He listened in a way that made me feel seen, and that realization unsettled me more than indifference ever could have. Asterisk, as the conversation deepened, I learned things about him I'd never known. Loneliness he never shared. Regrets that clung to him quietly. He spoke without drama, without self-pity, but with an honesty that felt newly uncovered. I listened, nodding, offering careful words. Somewhere in that exchange, a line blurred, not crossed, just softened. Asterisk, I became aware of the silence between sentences, of how long our pauses lasted, of how my name sounded when he said it, slower than necessary. None of it was overt. That was the problem. It was subtle enough to doubt, gentle enough to excuse. Asterisk, I reminded myself who he was, who my father was, what this connection meant. But emotion doesn't always respect logic. It creeps in through small openings, through shared vulnerability, through being understood at the wrong time by the wrong person. Asterisk, he didn't touch me. He didn't raise his voice or lean too close. Instead, he said something quiet that changed everything. A sentence framed as honesty, not desire. A confession disguised as trust. He admitted that my presence comforted him in ways he hadn't expected. That he felt something he shouldn't and didn't know what to do with it. Asterisk, the words didn't land loudly. They settled slowly, heavily. I felt heat rise in my face, not from attraction, but from shock. From the sudden responsibility of knowing something I never asked to know. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. My thoughts tangled between disbelief and understanding, between loyalty and compassion. Asterisk, in that moment, I realized how fragile boundaries truly are. How they don't always shatter with force, but erode through kindness, through conversation, through silence held too long. Asterisk, I stood up soon after, making an excuse that barely sounded like one. He didn't stop me. He didn't argue or apologize. He only looked at me with an expression that carried both regret and hope, and that hurt more than anything else could have. Asterisk, when I stepped outside, the night air felt colder than it should have. I sat in my car without turning the key, replaying every word, every pause. Nothing irreversible had happened, and yet I knew something already had. Trust doesn't need to be broken loudly to be changed forever. Asterisk, I drove home knowing that whatever came next, I had crossed into a space where innocence no longer lived. And I understood, with aching clarity, that some invitations are not meant to be accepted, even when they arrive wrapped in familiarity and concern. After that, I tried to return to who I had been before his words entered my life. I told myself that time would dull the edges, that distance would correct what awareness had disturbed. On the surface, things appeared unchanged. I woke up, went to work, answered messages, and laughed when required. But internally, everything felt slightly off, as if I were living a version of my life that no longer fit quite right. Asterisk, silence became my discipline. I stopped checking my phone as often, stopped wondering whether his name would appear. When it didn't, relief mixed with disappointment in ways that unsettled me. I hated that contradiction most of all. I had not chosen him, yet part of me still responded to the absence he left behind. It forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Restraint does not erase feeling. It only hides it behind intention. Asterisk, family gatherings grew heavier. My father spoke freely, unaware of the tension his friend's name carried for me now. Each mention felt like a quiet test of composure. I learned how much energy it takes to appear unchanged. I measured my reactions carefully, guarding expressions that once came naturally. Carrying knowledge that could not be shared is a subtle burden. It doesn't crush you all at once. It wears you down slowly. Asterisk, I replayed everything endlessly, searching for the moment where I should have turned away sooner, spoken less, listened differently. I questioned whether kindness itself had been the doorway, whether empathy, offered without caution, had blurred lines I didn't even know were vulnerable. These thoughts didn't lead to answers, only to deeper self-examination. Asterisk, days passed, and weeks. He kept his distance, honoring the boundary I had drawn. That should have made things easier. Instead, it sharpened the weight of what had almost been. There were no apologies repeated, no attempts to rewrite the past. Just a mutual understanding that something had been acknowledged and then set aside. That kind of restraint demands maturity, but it also leaves no illusion to hide behind. Asterisk, I noticed how often my thoughts returned to that conversation when I was alone. Not because I wanted more, but because it had revealed something about myself I hadn't known. That I was capable of being pulled by emotional closeness, even when logic argued against it. That being seen, even briefly, can feel intoxicating when it arrives unexpectedly. Asterisk, guilt followed closely behind those realizations. Not because I had acted, but because I had felt. I wondered whether feeling itself was a betrayal, whether emotional honesty required punishment, even when it remained private. There was no guidebook for that kind of infidelity, no clear rules, just an internal reckoning that demanded integrity without recognition. Asterisk, I considered telling my father more than once. Each time, I stopped myself. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Some truths don't heal when exposed. Some only transfer pain from one person to another without resolving anything. I carried the responsibility of that choice quietly, knowing it would shape my relationship with him in subtle, permanent ways. Asterisk, eventually, I reached a point where avoidance no longer felt like progress. I couldn't spend my life reacting to something that had already ended. Acceptance had to replace vigilance. I allowed myself to acknowledge the experience for what it was, a moment of emotional vulnerability shared between two people at a time when it should not have been. Neither a love story nor a scandal. Just a fracture that never fully broke the surface. Asterisk, understanding that didn't erase the discomfort, but it gave it context. It allowed me to move forward without rewriting history or denying my own capacity for complexity. I learned that morality isn't always tested by action alone. Sometimes it's tested by what you feel and choose not to pursue. Asterisk, by the time the weight began to lift, I knew I had changed. Not in a way anyone else could see, but in a way that mattered. I had learned how fragile trust can be, how easily emotion can mislead, and how strength often appears not in dramatic refusal, but in quiet consistency. Asterisk, what remained was not longing, but clarity. And clarity, I realized, is often the most difficult outcome of all, because once you see yourself honestly, there is no returning to innocence, only moving forward with intention. Time didn't resolve anything the way I expected it to. Instead of fading, the experience settled into me, becoming quieter but heavier, like something learned the hard way. I stopped measuring days by how little I thought about him and started noticing how much effort it took to keep my thoughts from drifting back. That alone told me how deeply the moment had lodged itself inside me. Asterisk, I avoided him carefully, not dramatically. I changed routines, left gatherings early, kept conversations brief when avoidance wasn't possible. No one noticed. That was the most unsettling part. Emotional fractures don't announce themselves. They hide behind normal behavior, behind politeness, behind the assumption that everything is fine because nothing has visibly broken. Asterisk, at night, when distraction was no longer possible, the questions returned. Not about him, but about myself. Why his honesty had affected me so deeply. Why I hadn't shut it down faster. I understood then that the danger hadn't been his words alone, but my readiness to receive them. I had been open at a moment when openness carried risk. Asterisk, I thought often about the idea of distance, how people treat it as a cure when it is really just a pause. Distance gave me space to think, but it didn't give me answers. It only removed urgency, and without urgency, emotion has room to echo. I replayed his expression when I drew the line, the quiet acceptance, the restraint. It would have been easier if he had reacted badly. Instead, his composure made the situation feel more real, more complex. Asterisk, guilt evolved into something less sharp but more persistent. It wasn't about disloyalty in action, but disloyalty in awareness. I had seen him differently, and that alone altered the emotional landscape of my life. I realized that once perception changes, innocence doesn't return. You can choose how you act, but you can't choose not to know. Asterisk, my relationship with my father shifted in ways I struggled to articulate. Nothing was said, yet something was altered. I became more protective, more attentive, as if proximity could compensate for what I carried silently. Each ordinary interaction reminded me of what he trusted me not to disrupt. That trust weighed heavily, but it also grounded me. It reminded me of what mattered most. Asterisk, there were moments when I almost reached out to his friend, not for connection, but for resolution. I wanted to confirm that the boundary still stood, that time hadn't distorted intentions. But I stopped myself. Seeking reassurance would have reopened a door I had worked hard to close. Sometimes restraint means accepting uncertainty rather than soothing it. Asterisk, gradually, I began to understand the true consequence of emotional infidelity. It isn't exposure or fallout. It's the internal division it creates. A part of you knows the right choice. Another part questions why it felt difficult. Living with that split requires maturity, not drama. It requires you to carry conflicting truths without resolving them through action. Asterisk I. Learn to let the discomfort exist without reacting to it. I allowed the thoughts to pass without judgment, acknowledging them without feeding them. That practice didn't erase the memory, but it loosened its grip. I wasn't trying to forget. I was trying to integrate asterisk when enough time had passed. I could finally see the situation with clearer eyes. What happened was not love, and it was not harmless. It was a convergence of timing, loneliness, and emotional availability. Understanding that stripped it of its power. It transformed it from temptation into lesson. Asterisk, I noticed a change in how I related to others afterward. I became more cautious with emotional openness, more aware of the responsibility it carries. Sharing vulnerability creates bonds, and bonds demand boundaries. That awareness didn't make me colder. It made me more deliberate. Asterisk. What surprised me most was that the weight didn't disappear, it redistributed. It turned into something quieter, resolve. I knew then that I would not allow that moment to define me, but I also refused to dismiss it as insignificant. Growth rarely comes from comfort. It comes from moments that challenge your sense of self and force you to choose who you want to be. Asterisk, by the end of that period, I wasn't healed, but I was steadier. I no longer felt pulled toward what could not exist. I felt anchored to what must. And in that anchoring, I discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The strength to live with clarity. Even when clarity comes at the cost of simplicity. Eventually, the tension stopped feeling like something I needed to manage every day. Not because it disappeared, but because I accepted that it had reached its end. There was no dramatic conclusion waiting for me, no moment of exposure or confession that would close the chapter neatly. What remained was a choice I had already made. One I continued to stand by quietly. Asterisk, the last time I spoke to him, it was brief and measured. There was no emotional urgency left, no unfinished plea hanging between words. We spoke like two people who understood that some conversations are not meant to be continued. He acknowledged the distance without resentment. I acknowledged it without apology. In that exchange, there was a mutual understanding that restraint had become the only form of respect left to us. I realized then that closure doesn't always arrive with relief. Sometimes it arrives with acceptance. Accepting that something mattered without allowing it to grow. Accepting that feeling does not automatically justify pursuit. Accepting that maturity often looks like choosing the quieter path. Even when no one is watching, asterisk life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. My father remained unaware, and I carried that knowledge with a sense of responsibility rather than burden. Protecting him was not an act of deception. It was an act of care. I understood that honesty is not always about disclosure, but about intention. I had no intention of letting a moment of emotional weakness fracture my faith, foundation of his trust. Asterisk. What surprised me was how much the experience reshaped my understanding of love. I had once believed love announced itself boldly, demanded action, and justified risk. Now I understood that love is also revealed through what you refuse to do, through the boundaries you uphold, through the people you choose not to hurt. Even when doing so costs you something internally. Asterisk, there were moments of quiet sadness, but they no longer felt heavy. They felt reflective. I could look back without longing, without resentment, and without romanticizing what never truly existed. What we shared was not a future or a promise. It was a mirror held up at an unexpected moment, showing us parts of ourselves we hadn't prepared to see. Asterisk, I carried forward the lesson it gave me. I became more attentive to emotional proximity, more aware of how easily connection can blur into confusion. I learned that being seen is powerful and power requires responsibility. That lesson stayed with me, shaping how I engaged with others, how I offered empathy without overstepping into intimacy. Asterisk over time, the memory settled into something distant but clear. Not a regret, not a secret that haunted me, but a reminder. A reminder that integrity is not proven in moments of ease, but in moments of temptation handled with restraint. That choosing not to act can be just as defining as choosing to act. Asterisk I no longer wondered what might have happened if I had chosen differently. That curiosity faded as clarity strengthened. I knew that any path built on emotional betrayal, no matter how subtle, would have required too much compromise. Not just of loyalty, but of self-respect. And self-respect, once traded, is difficult to reclaim. Asterisk, what remained was a quiet sense of growth. I have faced a situation that tested my values without forcing a spectacle. I have learned that life doesn't always challenge you loudly. Sometimes it whispers, waits, and watches how you respond when no one else is aware of the stakes. Asterisk, if there was a loss, it was the loss of simplicity. But in its place, I gained discernment. I gained the ability to sit with discomfort without seeking escape. I gained confidence in my capacity to choose what aligns with who I want to be, rather than what momentary emotion suggests. Asterisk in the end, nothing scandalous happened. No lines were crossed in the way stories often dramatize. And yet, everything that mattered was decided internally. That is where the real story lived, not in what was done, but in what was deliberately left undone. Asterisk in that choice, quiet and unseen, became the most honest expression of love I could offer to my father, to myself, and to the life I wanted to continue living with integrity intact.